Even to this day, you can read church history textbooks written by white scholars who will tell you that the ancient churches of Egypt and Ethiopia and Nubia, that they did not believe in Jesus's full humanity. And nothing could be further from the truth. Those books written by modern European church scholars, they usually don't even know how to read these languages. So they are condemning an entire trajectory, an entire half of church history to heresy without even having ever read these writings in their original language. Syriac was a language that was from modern day Syria and part of Turkey, but Christians that spoke Syriac, because it was a dialect of Aramaic, the language of Jesus, and that Christians who spoke that language, they ended up going all over the Asian continent. I mean, literally, not only throughout the Middle East, but all along the Silk Road, as far as China and all the way down into India, as far as Sri Lanka. I mean, literally, the gospel was spreading all over the Asian continent, and primarily through Syriac-speaking people from the Middle East who were carrying the gospel. So again, any claim that Christianity is white man's religion is also counterable when you look at Asian Christianity, because the Christianity first came to Asia from Middle Eastern Christians who spoke Syriac, who ain't have, nothing to do with the Roman, Greco-Roman Constantinian Empire. But it came in way before, again, at the first century. And I mean, for example, the Syriac Bible came straight from Hebrew, straight into Syriac. It didn't even go through the Greek Septuagint. And so that's just a visual example about how the way in which the gospel came straight from, Hebrew, Middle Eastern, Israelite people in the Levant, the apostles, and it went straight into their Syriac-speaking neighbors in Asia without any Western or European or Roman intermediary. But it went straight, and then from there, it went straight into Persia and then into Central Asia and into China, again, with no European intervention in the whole thing. We have to start to decolonize the way we do history. A lot of times church history textbooks will tell you Council of Nicaea was the first council, and we'll say it's the first council. It's not the first council. It's the first Roman council, right? And there were Christians in the Persian Empire, at the same amount of time as there was in the Roman Empire, and they actually had councils before the Council of Nicaea. They actually had a council even years before the Council of Nicaea. So the Council of Nicaea was the first Roman council, but there were churches in Persia who were not even in the Roman Empire. They were having their own councils, again, making it untenable to say it's a white man's religion, because there was already Christians in Persia. They were doing their own thing, having their own councils. There was Christians in India having their own councils. There was, Christians in Arabia having their own councils. But the Council of Nicaea, the councils for example, there's the Council of Seleucia in 315. There's the Council of Mar Dardisho. There's so many other councils that we need to have another podcast to talk about that, because there's all these other councils that have nothing to do with European church history that we need to talk about. But if we're talking about Roman church history, we're talking about European church history, then the Council of Nicaea is considered to be the first ecumenical council, but there were other ones as well. Now, the Council of Chalcedon was considered the fourth ecumenical council, but I always want to add it's the fourth Roman ecumenical council. It's the fourth European council. There was Nicaea in 325, there was Constantinople in 381, and then there was Ephesus in 431, and then Chalcedon happened in 451. Here at the Meacham School of Hymenot, we use the Ethiopian word for theology. Hymenot is the word for theology. And the Ethiopian theologians during this ancient time period, they would often use the phrase Hymenot retet. And Hymenot retet, the word retet in Ge'ez means orthodox, right? Because, again, people who say y'all white man's religion, but even unfortunately, the majority of our people who are in the theological realm will say things like, when you're defending the idea of orthodoxy, then you're defending a Eurocentric concept, right? There is no such thing as right and wrong belief, right? They want to focus on justice and they want to focus on liberation for our people, which is good. And we affirm that, right? But they will say things like, well, the idea of a right belief or a wrong belief, which is, orthodox or heterodox, that's what it means. It means like right belief, right doxology, doxology that is orthos, that is straight, that is correct. That they will say things like, well, that was invented by white folks, that was invented by Europeans, right? And for us, the real right belief is all about, is your religion liberative, right? Well, when we know actually the history of the Black church is that it's both, that it's right belief and right practice. And that's what our Savior himself said, that love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so that is what right belief is, what orthodoxy is biblically, and that's what African theologians were defending. So it's inaccurate to say that's that's not real, right? That's a white invention, that it was white folks who came wrong saying that there was right and wrong belief. But no, there were African theologians who were the earliest ones defending orthodoxy, even way before the Council of Nicaea. And as African theologians encountered Roman pagan religion and traditional Egyptian religion, traditional Ethiopian religion, they argued persuasively for right action, for sure, to be sure. And this is especially in the monastic communities. They were arguing for social justice and human flourishing for African people, but they were also arguing for retet, right? Retet is that Ethiopian word for orthodoxy, and hymenot retet, right, which means orthodox theology. In the case of Ethiopia, they defended hymenot retet. And again, if you read the writings of Georgius of Sagala, he was arguing vehemently against traditional Ethiopian African religion, and he was arguing for hymenot retet, orthodox theology, right, or orthodox belief. And so that's what believers in all times, in all places, have argued for, that the orthodoxy is beliefs and practices that are oriented around the gospel, the saving gospel message of Jesus Christ, who is the only way, truth, and life. And anything against that is not orthodoxy. It is heterodox. It is not retet. Especially if you talk to like Egyptian and Ethiopian Christians today, they will tell you that not only did they affirm all of what we as Christians today would call orthodox, but they were the ones who originally were the ones articulating it, and they were the ones really defending it. Alexander at the Council of Nicaea was one of the main people who was defending against Arianism, and Arianism was the belief saying that Jesus was a lesser being, that he was created being. There was a time he didn't exist. Now here's the thing, because these folks always want to say, oh, Council of Nicaea, Constantine and the Roman Empire invented Christianity. But again, another thing they don't know, that Constantine was very, the nature of his faith was very dubious. And again, we have to look at the fact that after the Council of Nicaea, he flip-flopped and he began to support the Arians, who said that Jesus was not God. So Constantine was actually going back and forth, wishy-washy, and he began to persecute Nicene Christians like Athanasius, who took over as bishop of Egypt, and his son Constantius also was strongly an Arian. And Athanasius was actually in exile because of Constantius, the Roman Empire during the mid-4th century. And he wrote a whole treatise against Constantius and critiquing him for his Arian belief. And even so, at a time when the European Empire, the Roman Empire, was under heretical leadership, was actually trying to promote heresy, promote the idea that Jesus is not fully divine, it was African people like Athanasius and Pachomius and many other theologians in Africa who were actually defending the Orthodox belief. And so again, how are they going to say that the doctrine of Jesus' divinity and Orthodox theology was an invention of Roman Empire, when the Roman Empire, the same emperor that they claim is the one who invented the doctrine of divinity, was actually persecuting one of the African bishop who was actually one of its greatest defenders, and sent him into exile specifically for believing. And the Coptic-speaking community, in Egypt, like Pachomius and the other monastic communities throughout Egypt, stood with him in Orthodoxy. And from that time going forward, there was a strong association between Egyptian and Ethiopian churches and Christians, and they were united against the Roman Empire. So at a time when the Roman Empire was promoting heresy, the idea that Jesus isn't God, African Christians were actually united in the belief that Jesus is fully God. The Council of Chalcedon needs to become a much more studied and known and talked about event in our circles and in our, especially as Black people, but even other minorities as well, because again, that council represents the first time that European Christians said, no, the way we talk about Jesus and the way we do theology is the only right way. That council was very detrimental and very consequential for the Christian faith, for Christian history, because again, that was a major schism that was totally unnecessary. That and honestly, this is not just my opinion. Literally, the Roman Catholic Pope and the Syrian Orthodox Pope, just a few years ago, actually signed a joint statement saying the same thing I'm saying basically like, yeah, we really just weren't understanding each other, and we're all Christians here, and we just weren't understanding each other's languages and culture. So even the leaders of these communities have said that today. It's not just my opinion. Roman Christians were not really clear on how to talk about God. First, the question was, is Jesus God? And the Council of Nicaea affirmed what had already been argued for hundreds of years, that yes, Jesus is fully God. And they had to say it in a council because it was the first time that anybody had ever stood up to say the opposite, that he wasn't God, which was Arius. But there were many other Roman Christians, Irenaeus of Lyon and Tertullian and Justin Martyr, who had already said hundreds of years before that Jesus was God. Now in 451, the Council of Chalcedon, that was when the issue came to a head, and they wanted to specifically talk about Jesus' humanity and divinity and how those things work together and how we talk about that. Well, there were Christians in Egypt who were starting to say that Jesus has one nature, that his humanity and divinity are in one nature. And so they had a council in 449 in Egypt that said that Jesus has one nature. Well, the Roman church heard about this, and they wanted, the Roman church wanted to say, okay, well, the Egyptians are saying that Jesus has one nature, and we don't like that. And so the Romans had their own council in 451 at Chalcedon, and that rejected the Egyptians and said the Egyptians are heretical, who are saying that Jesus is only one nature. The churches of Africa were all united with Egypt in rejecting the Roman council. And then also, as I mentioned, many of the Syrian theologians were also against this Roman decision, this Council of Chalcedon, and they also were saying that no, Jesus is one person and one nature. And so that was the moment that the Council of Chalcedon was the moment that there was a major split between the dominant church of the Roman Empire and the churches that were in Egypt. And all these Christians were in Middle East, in Africa, and in Europe. They all believed that Jesus was fully God and fully human, and that he's the only way, truth, and the life. But they had different ways of talking about that, his humanity and divinity. The Romans were saying he's one person and two natures. The Middle East and African folks were saying, no, he's one person and one nature, but that one nature is fully God and fully human. He is fully God and he's fully human. And so, there was really a cultural linguistic misunderstanding. But with the church, the Roman church that had more power, not only did the Roman church excommunicate many of the African and Middle Eastern Christians and call them heretics unjustly, but they began to literally oppress African and Asian Christians, literally going into their churches, literally removing their church leaders and replacing them with ones that agreed with the Roman theology, and literally killing people, and literally going into monasteries and churches and enslaving people. This was European Christians hurting African Christians. This was Christian on Christian violence. This was European Christians persecuting Middle Eastern and African Christians. And when they did that for 200 years, right? From 451 to 640, they were doing this for 200 years. Were persecuting Christians in the Middle East and Africa. That severely limited their ability to continue to spread the gospel across Africa and across Asia. And so European Christians thwarted the missionary efforts and the ministerial efforts of African and Middle Eastern Christians. And then what happened in the year 600? That's when Islam came around. Islam comes out of nowhere and conquers the Persian Empire and much of the Roman Empire. And the Romans had already been persecuting African and Asian Christians for 200 years. So when the Muslims came up and took over those parts of the world, the Romans just retreated and said, fine, you can have them because we don't like them anyway. We've been persecuting them for 200 years anyway. They don't listen anyway. And so then already persecuted Christians in Africa and in the Middle East now came under Islamic control, and that also eventually hindered their ability to continue to spread the gospel. And unfortunately, the gospel ended up arriving to the shores of West Africa or to the Americas, to indigenous people, through slave and colonial ships. Not the way God had intended it, because the gospel was spreading already from Africans to other Africans and from Asians to other Asians. So what does this mean? What this means is that the gospel was on its way to our ancestry, to our ancestors in West Africa and in Central Africa, just like it was on its way all across the Asian continent into the Pacific Islands, on its way into the Americas to indigenous people. The gospel was spreading as God intended it to be. And what got in the way of that? White supremacy.